React is fantastic once things click. I remember when I was just starting working with React, I was really struggling. It was really hard to get things to work the way that I expect them. And the problem was that I did not think in React yet. But once that things click, there is no coming back. It's just an awesome feeling when you're able to create wherever you want when you work with React instead of against it. Actually, the inspiration of this video came from this Reddit post with the same name, React is fantastic once things click. And the person is saying, I've been using React for a little bit more than 2 years, and more recently, everything sort of started to come together. In the beginning, I was using effects incorrectly, and I didn't have a full understanding of how refs worked. These two documents were game-changing, and that's exactly what I want to show you today, especially this first one. In the comments, you're going to see that a lot of people are saying that the first blog, you might not need a useEffect, is a must-read. So let's check this out. Now, if you watch my previous videos or any other YouTuber who talks about ReactJS, then you know it's always best to avoid effects because it just makes it really hard to understand what's happening and just a source of a lot of bugs. So the first really typical mistake that you can make with using effects is to have a state that is unneeded. So taking a look at this, we have a state for the first name and a state for the last name. And then we have another state for the full name. And every time that the first or last name changes, we have this effect that fires, and this sets the full name. And the problem here is that every time that you set the state, actually React just calls your entire function. So what you can do is literally just get rid of this state and have a normal variable that you can derive from the states. And this is a corrected version. You just have a constant inside this function. I know the word constant seems like we're not dealing with variables, but since we're inside this function and we know that every time that you set the state, the whole function is going to be called again, your component is going to be re-rendered, then you don't need to have another useEffect. And in this previous code, this also meant that every time that you would change the first or last name, React will have to run your effect again, meaning setting a state again, the full name, and then re-rendering the component. And that's something you don't want to have. And what I also really like about this is that it reads from top to bottom. And if you compare it with the previous code, it's not flowing from top to bottom, which makes it really hard to understand. Now, this is another example of not using derived state. And this is something you can come across in real life. So we have a state for the to-dos and a state for the filter. And inside the useEffect, we are actually filtering the visible to-dos. And this is the same as before. We can just have a normal variable and just filter the to-dos. Now, if you have this operation that actually is really expensive, which is rarely the case, to be honest, but if you have a really complex function that just takes a long time to run, then you can also memoize it. You can use useMemo for that. And this means that every time your React component is rendered, meaning when React calls your component as a normal function, then we're gonna call useMemo, and in the background, we're gonna check if to-dos and filters changed. So if they change, we're gonna call this first argument of useMemo, and if they did not change, we just used the previous result. So here it's important to pass in all the arguments that are used inside useMemo, and of course, you should not pass in a value that changes in every render. So if you create a new object inside the function and you pass it here to useMemo, then it will simply not work because you have a new reference every time. You can of course also write this memo as a single line, but I think here a lot is happening. I would prefer to actually just write it as a normal useMemo in multiple lines. Then another anti-pattern that I have used myself a lot is resetting all state when a prop change. So here, for example, we have a state inside a profile page, and this profile page gets a user ID as an argument. And of course, we want to reset the state inside this profile page when this user ID change. And for that, we are using a useEffect. And this is a really common pattern, especially when you have the user clicking or selecting an element and then you want to show some details. And inside that details card, there is a state. Now, the problem here is mainly that you have to render twice inside this profile page, which is something that you actually can easily avoid. And the way to do that is by using keys. Keys are a really cool feature of React. You have used them for sure when you are mapping over an array, but here what we're using them for is to basically tell React that this component is completely reliant on the user ID, you can think of the key as an identifier or an ID for this profile. So when it changes, we're actually dealing with a completely other component. And in this case, React will basically just remove this component and create a new one. So all the state inside the profile is going to be reset. Now, there are a lot of use cases for effects in React, but as you can see, in most of the cases, when you get rid of them, it just simplifies the code a lot. Next on the list, we have adjusting some state when a prop changes. And here in the example, you can see that every time that the items change, we want to reset the selection. Now, an easy way to fix this would be to basically just get rid of the effect and calling setState inside the component itself. And here they're describing that this is going to internally throw an error and immediately retry to render your component. I'm actually not the biggest fan of this approach. I would actually rather just use a key, just like we did in the previous example, to force the component to re-render. I really like here that they also gave this example with a list and a selected item, because this is also a very common source of problems. So we have a list of items. These can be either props or a local state. And then we have a state for the selected ID. And then we can use the selected ID combined with the items to find the item that is selected. And then we can use this to render the UI. And the wrong way of doing this would be to basically have a state for the selected item as an object. And the reason behind that is that if items change, then you're going to end up with an old value inside useState. I think what we can take out of this example is, instead of having duplicate state, we should try to save the minimum inside states and then combine the states to derive the values. Next on the list, we have sharing logic between event handlers. So here we have a product page and then we have a useEffect. And here we're just checking if the product is in cart, then we show a notification, added product to the shopping cart. Now, when a user adds a product to the cart, of course, this product is going to be changed and then the notification is going to be shown. But the problem here is that you're going to have a lot of false negatives, which means that the notification is going to be shown to the user even when the user didn't add the product right now to the cart. And that's especially the case when the user reloads the page. And this is how you would actually fix the code. You would just add this function inside byProduct and then call this function byProduct in multiple places. Then we have sending a post request. This is actually a very similar example to the one we just looked at. And the problem here is that we are using an effect to submit data to the backend. This is actually really bad because you can never be sure how many times your effect is going to be called by React, which means that you can actually submit it twice. And the easiest way, of course, to get rid of this is to just handle it inside the handle submit. So what's happening here is that we have a state JSON to submit, and this is set inside of this handle submit function. And then we have an effect that checks when this is set, then we are sending a request. And of course, this is just super complicated. The easiest and actually the correct way to do this would be inside the handle submit function. And this is what it's going to look like. Instead of having a state, you just get rid of it. And when the user clicks on submit, you just make your post request. Of course, it's worth mentioning when you are dealing with loading data from the backend or making API calls to the backend, then React query is going to simplify your code a lot. Here, this would be a mutation. And this would also provide you with loading and error states that you can show the user. And this will just make the UI really, really user-friendly. I've actually already created a free course on React query here on YouTube. You can go check it out when you finish this video. Now, the next example is just a combination of all the points that we have talked about until now. And this is the kind of code that I personally wrote when I was just getting started with React. I also programmed a quiz-like game, something like Duolingo, just for myself. And my code really looked like this. So here we have a lot of use effects that just try to synchronize between the different states that we have. We also have this derived state is game over. And this one should be true when round is bigger than 5. And this obviously can just be a normal variable. And of course, we also have an alert that is shown when the game is over. And here we can see a corrected version. Is game over is just derived during the rendering. And then we handle everything inside the click handler instead of using effects. And we also show this notification when the game is over. And this, of course, makes it really easy to understand what is happening. I mean, if you compare it to this code, this is just really hard to understand. And the trickiest part is that some effects were setting the states, which means that an effect would trigger another one, and this is just the source of a lot of bugs and headaches. Now, the next point is about initializing the application, and here they're talking about when you want to call a function once in your entire application when it just starts. And they're saying that we should not use useEffect for that with empty dependencies. And the problem here is that effects run twice in development. And this comes actually from React's strict mode. And the idea behind this is that it should help you as a developer to find the effects that are lacking a cleanup function. Whether you think this is helpful for developers is open for discussion, but if you want to call a function just once, then you can just set a global variable, and this is outside of your components, and then you can set it to true once you have called your functions. Now, next point is about notifying parent components about state changes. And if you take a look at the code, here we have a toggle component and it has an internal state is on. And every time that the state changes, we're calling this prop onChange with the new value. And the idea here is to just notify the parent every time that the internal state changes. And this is just a code smell because the state does not really need to be inside the toggle. If the parent element wants to know about the state, then it should have the state itself, and then you can pass isOn and set isOn as props to the toggle. And really the way to think about component state is that each component can be either controlled or uncontrolled. So in the case that you have a state inside a component, it means that this component is uncontrolled. So the parent component cannot control the state inside of it. And the opposite of that would be to have a controlled component. So a controlled component does not have a state internally, but it receives a state and a callback set state in the props, and the parent is actually the one that holds the state. And there is an example here showing how it looks like. This is, for example, a fully controlled component, and the state lives inside the parent component, and we just pass these props isOn and onChange. So that's a pattern you should always use when you find yourself trying to synchronize between multiple parent and child states. Just take the state and put it in the parent and have a controlled component. Next, we have passing data to the parent. I think I have came across this kind of code before where you have a child that fetches data from some API, and once it's available, it has a callback that sets the data in the parent. If you think about it, this is also very similar to what we had before. We have duplicate state. So an easier way would be to just take this call, use some API and put it in the parent and just pass it down. And it's going to look like this. Now, if you're using React query, then you're going to have a custom hook, and then you can call that custom hook in the parent and in the child without having to pass the data, if that's something that you want to do. And React query will also make sure that the data is only fetched once from the backend. But for this example, the simplest way would be to just put the API call inside the parent and just pass it to the child. Then there's this point about subscribing to an external store. I personally don't work a lot with useSync external store, so I think I would just skip this one. Now, this is one of my favorite examples about fetching data. And here we have a useEffect that is used to make an API call, and then we set a state. And although this may seem like a normal code, this has a real problem. And the problem here is that we have a race condition. So the way that this race condition gets triggered is when these parameters change too fast, which triggers the effect twice. And you can have the case where the first request takes longer than the second one, and then it overwrites the state with the old value. And a way to fix this would be to have a flag. Here we're going to use this ignore variable. And inside the effect, we're going to return a cleanup function. This is called after each effect. And we're going to set it to true. And what happens is that after we fetch the results, we're going to check if this needs to be ignored, if it's not active anymore. And only in that case, we set the value. Honestly, they should really just add a link to React query here, because it does not make sense to write this kind of code by hand. React query does that internally, and it offers way more than this. So it just does not make sense. So applying these tips will not only drastically improve your code, but really help you think in React. If you found this video interesting, then please make sure to subscribe, since I'm working on some really cool video ideas right now, and I can't wait to show them to you. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.